Okay, so this is this sipping practice where, as I say we're going to do a little bit of a sit, a sip, and a savor, if that's what you fancy giving a go. So initially, just kind of getting comfortable. If you have a drink handy that you want to kind of hold on to, just getting that into a comfortable position to be holding that. Make any adjustments, running out of the room frenetically if you realize I wanted to get that drink, but forgot to get it, whatever it might be is your thing. And just taking a moment to notice what kind of comes into your awareness in terms of what you can sense holding that drink. Maybe it's a sense of the temperature. Is it cool? Is it warm? Maybe your eyes are drawn to it, so you're looking at that. Sitting with my kind of clear glass, I can see the reflection in the surface. Maybe it's the feel of it, the weight of it. Even if you kind of move it around a bit, you can actually feel the fact there's liquid in there, maybe, just how it sloshes around. You might even slightly hear your own kind of small sounds coming from how you're holding it or if you put it down. And then around holding that cup, maybe just noticing what else is here to be sensed. So maybe the sounds you can hear just in the environment, hooking your attention while you're holding that cup or that container, I should say. Maybe there's other stuff catching your eye around you, movements on the screen, perhaps. It could be maybe the feeling of your body in contact with perhaps the floor or the chair, or anything else you're noticing, just what you can sense right now, just catching your attention, getting a feel of what's around you and having that cup, that container in your awareness. And then maybe just see what it's like to make the decision to have a sip of your drink, and maybe slowly bringing the container up to your lips. See what it's like to take a little sip, and noticing the sensations that become available having had that little sip. Maybe the temperature and how that temperature may change. Maybe it's texture, the feel of the liquid in your mouth. Maybe it's a taste. And maybe around all of that, there's kind of liking, not that bothered. If you find your attention's wandering away from those sensations in your mouth, how is it to bring your attention back to what you're noticing there in your mouth right now, if that's comfortable to do? And each time your attention wanders off, it's like to come back to those sensations. And maybe, of course, swallowing whenever you need to swallow and following those sensations down if you wish, of the feeling of swallowing. And then, for as long as you want to, maybe just sitting with the kind of residual feelings, sensations there of having had that sip, just savoring any sensations present. And then, if you wish, once more, having another kind of coming back to the start again, and once more, maybe just sitting with that drink for a moment. And this time, maybe coming back to physical sensations you have available while sitting. So maybe it's the feel of the cup in your hand, the container in your hand. Maybe alongside that, there's a sense of what you're hearing, maybe what you're seeing or feeling of contact. What's it like to have a few moments of sitting with the feel of the drink or the look of it, and maybe what else is present? And coming back to that if you find your attention wanders off elsewhere. Then maybe having another sip or a glug. No means limit yourself, and noticing taste, texture, temperature, other sensations, swallowing when you need to, following that. And then just savouring what's there, however long you want to. Residual feelings coming back to what you're noticing there, maybe around your mouth. Sometimes it can be nice to bring in a sense of appreciation, just all the kind of web of people we know, don't know, the world around us that makes it possible to have this particular drink here with us at this particular moment. And then maybe bring that to an end by shifting a bit if you wish, maybe looking around, checking into what's here. And if there's any sense of that being a helpful thing to do, to have that little mindful sip, then kind of knowing that any time during this session you could replicate that whole short practice of just maybe having a moment just to connect briefly into what it's like to hold the container as you're sitting, to take the sip and then to savor. And I wanted to start with that particular practice because it's something that colleagues at the Christie that actually grew out of some of our kind of early training at the Christie have developed around helping people who are receiving cancer care, who are in panic states over maybe going into very restrictive scanning facilities. Maybe some of the treatments involve really quite kind of invasive, difficult experiences. And a team there, which is who we support through the funds we raise through our training itself at the Christie, they've developed almost like a crash team for people in panic states, where they come in with a range of different approaches to help people rapidly get to a place where they can at least tolerate the intervention procedure that they're going through. And one of those they find really helpful is taking a sip. And one of the reasons for that is that when we take a sip, we can't actually hyperventilate when we take a sip. And rather than doing maybe the more traditional 7-Eleven breathing, things like that, that we might use in panic states, when we take a sip, we have to change our breathing pattern. It's almost like it flips us into a different learnt behavioral pattern of, oh, I was panicking, now I'm sipping. And we have to use different systems to do sipping. It's also quite a strong, vivid set of sensory sensations. And if it's done in the company of someone who is calm with you while you're feeling panicky, then just that kind of learnt social interaction through having a sip of something together is very kind of steadying for many people. That sense of, yeah, I'm here with someone and we're having a sip and it's kind of normal, and this bit's okay. I can cope with having a sip. Also, maybe the very fact sipping activates our parasympathetic and resting digesting nervous system is quite helpful. So there could be kind of helpful things coming in with that as well. So I just like doing a sip as well as an initial mindfulness practice in many groups, because although yes, some people may struggle through maybe the cultural issues about sipping a drink with other people, but even people who have eating disorders may find it's possible to have a sip of something, particularly if if they're encouraged to bring their own drink to the session and sit from their own container, something that they're familiar with, then you're cutting out a lot of kind of unknowns and complications for people, so that um, it can be a very accessible way. And there's so much vivid sensory experience potentially available through contact, through looking, through even hearing. If you've got the sound, you can even make sounds with the container, and then the whole vivid experience of sipping something can be very vivid. So I find that a really nice kind of simple practice, and it's something that can often be done in clinical spaces where other things may not be possible. Kind of eating food may be really tricky, whereas people may have access to fluids. So that's just a kind of little starting point. What I'd like to move on to is to just take a bit of a step back, really, and think about our kind of stress systems, our survival systems, so that when we start to talk about how breath may interact when our survival systems, stress systems have become kind of chronically activated in some way, we've got some shared language around that. And I want to use what's probably very familiar to many of you, the kind of window of tolerance model. That there's all kinds of variations of this around. I just want to share the screen. My thought is to kind of talk around this a little bit and then have some time afterwards just to pick up any kind of thoughts or reactions around that. So here we go. So this is a version of the very kind of commonplace models you'll see around this kind of notion of the window of tolerance, coming out of the work of Daniel Siegel, Pat Ogden, with a smattering of Deb Dana and Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory coming in. So this kind of its ongoing development of this model. Not perfect. There's no perfect way of representing the complexity of human reaction, but I quite like this notion that we have a place, hopefully, where when we're feeling steady, when our social connection system is kind of more active, or our soothing system is more active, then we're kind of in a place where we feel okay, maybe even safe, where in this safer place we have the potential to connect to other people and feel that sense of interconnection. So it's where kind of our empathic sense can become active, and where we can also grow and learn. So where there's that sense of we have the capacity to meet challenges with a degree of steadiness and to grow into new situations, new relationships, new ways of doing things. This window of tolerance, though, is dynamic. So our capacity to kind of be okay with what's happening is variable. And there are times when we get kind of start to move out of that, things start to become too much. And I quite like breaking down what happens as we move out of that into a kind of halfway stage of alarm, which is where we begin to get bothered by what's going on. And the way we feel that is through maybe the beginning of kind of frustrations, irritations, uncertainties, anxieties. That becomes more and more dominant in our awareness until we get to a point where if that kind of increase of what we find stressful or difficult just carries on, we get triggered into a state of panic, a state of overwhelm, can be rage, but just what takes over these survival reactions that are designed to keep us safe. So they're designed to be protective, and they may be helpful in the very short term, but they can become stuck, repetitive habits that get triggered in situations which aren't so useful. And what we might see in phobic reactions would be a classic kind of way of understanding that, where something may have been meaningful at the beginning of the development of those reactions, but they start to get a momentum where we get triggered into these protective, instinctive reactions just taking over and hijacking us while they're active. If the level of overwhelm continues, we may feel unsafe to do things like our fight or flight type reactions, which underpin the alarm and panic states. And this is where we start moving into shutting down, with maybe a kind of intermediary stage of just feeling kind of less here, cut off. We're kind of feeling distant, maybe a bit dreamy, maybe kind of not fully present. But again, if that level of overwhelming, stressful triggers continues, we can go into a shutdown where the again these protective reactions come in, where we numb out, we fade out, we dissociate, we're not here, keeping us in a state where whatever feels overwhelming feels somewhat more manageable because we're not as kind of present with whatever's happening. And again, maybe really helpful in moments of kind of profound trauma when they're first happening. But if that becomes a repetitive behavior that starts to generalize into all kinds of other areas of our lives, then it can mean that we become chronically disconnected to what we're experiencing. The kind of optimistic kind of news around this is that our systems are amazingly capable of learning new behaviors. And so particularly if we're in supportive company, we can learn to widen that window of tolerance to increase our resilience. But if we feel threatened, unsafe, then that window comes in, making it much harder to feel steady, much harder to learn, to grow, much harder to feel connected to other people and connected to ourselves. And I think what's helpful is to apply that to thinking about how we might learn about mindfulness in a very general way before we pick up thinking about breathing in particular. So, this is just thinking about initial steps of learning about mindfulness. And I think one of the really important initial steps about learning about mindfulness is, if we can use a metaphor like learning to drive, there's a bit of learning to drive where you're just getting familiar with the controls. You're sitting maybe on the drive, or when the car's parked up somewhere, just getting a feel of what it's like to move the steering wheel, press the pedals. What do all these levers do? You might have seen them from a passenger's point of view, but you've never actually been there, maybe doing all those kind of mechanical things of making the kind of car do its stuff at that very basic level. And then hopefully once you've got the beginning of a feeling of that, you take it out. Maybe it's to a quiet side street, car park, old airstrip, whatever it might be, where you learn how to kind of feel okay in the kind of minimally challenging, safe situation where you're not having to deal with too much stuff all happening at once. And then having hopefully cultivated that sense of, yeah, I'm okay with this kind of level of driving, we then start to move into more challenging situations where we're going into maybe more difficult moments of driving, hopefully coming back into spaces where we feel we're kind of able to collect ourselves back with what's familiar. And by progressively dipping in and out of what feels kind of too much, we progressively widen our kind of window of tolerance. And I think in a similar way, that's what happens when we are learning mindfulness. We get familiar with the very fact I can choose where I can put my attention, that I can focus on different sensations, that when my attention's been hooked by something, I can choose to bring it back to what I'm choosing to focus on. Maybe that happens easily or more reluctantly, who knows? But we're just getting kind of familiar with the mechanics of what it's like to do any kind of mindfulness at all. And I think what's really helpful at that point is having really vivid, really distinct anchors for our attention. So we can see what it's like to have our attention focused on this particular part of what we're sensing, which then means when our attention moves away into maybe thinking or some other sensory experience, there's a clear contrast between where we were choosing to have our attention and where our attention ended up when it wanders off, getting hooked by something. Once we've got that kind of some familiarity around that, then if we want to come back to within our window of tolerance, if we've kind of got into a sticky situation where things kind of feel too much in some way, then I think the qualities of that focusing anchor that we're using to practice on become really important, that again they're vivid. So if, for instance, my attention's got really caught up in ruminating thoughts, brooding, fretting thoughts, or maybe I'm kind of disappearing kind of into a kind of half here state, having a vivid focusing anchor means even when I'm off in those thoughts, even when I'm kind of drifting off a bit, maybe there's still a little bit of a sensation of that vivid anchor around for me. It's easy to come back to, easy to find. Whereas if it's a vague anchor, then I may just lose complete track of that in the midst of whatever kind of difficult experiences may be happening. I think other important qualities, though, are that that anchor is neutral or pleasant. So that when I bring my attention back to it, I'm not having to use distress tolerance as a skill to focus in on that particular sensation. Because if I am having to, if what I'm choosing to focus on is unpleasant, then first of all, how steadying is that going to be when something unpleasant becomes the center of my attention? And we probably all have that sense of how whatever we focus on becomes magnified and more dominant in our awareness. The useful kind of common experience around that is how if you're watching something on telly and it gets a bit too scary, or you just don't want to kind of see what's there, it's like that Doctor Who thing of hiding behind the sofa. You might be able to cope with listening, but can you cope with actually seeing what's on the screen? So we can modify our emotional state by choosing kind of what we're perceiving. And if what we're perceiving is threatening, then that may be really quite something to try to steady yourself with something that feels um, unpleasant, even distressing, that in the background, if you're not consciously aware of it, is probably going to be triggering your stress systems. So not so helpful for being in that kind of window of tolerance when hopefully our stress systems are at a lower level. And then when we're resilience building, having a focusing anchor. So when we're dipping out into what may feel more challenging, how do we bring ourselves back to steadiness? Now, at some point, it may be there's elements like self-compassion, our cultivation of more open awareness are going to come into the mix here in terms of how we may feel more and more able to stay with what feels difficult, but still having an anchor that welcomes you back, that is vivid, makes it maybe feel more easy to take greater risks in terms of moving into what may feel more difficult or staying with what may feel more difficult with a sense of, yeah, that steadying anchor is still with me. So, thinking about that, I think it's really useful just to take a pause and to say, so if we're helping someone learn about what it is to be mindful, are we thinking about why we're choosing the particular mindfulness practice we've chosen with the particular focusing anchors that become available with that practice? And are we giving people choices around what they find vivid and what they find steadying in that particular context? Excuse me. Mm. I think this is where we come into notions of what person-centered mindfulness might be like, where we're giving people options, we're really prioritizing people's capacity to make their own choices about what they choose as their focusing anchor. And this is also where I think it comes into trauma sensitive practice, where we're thinking about the people we're working with, and we're wanting to discover whether anything we're offering as a mindfulness practice may actually be taking them into states which move them out of their window of tolerance and take them into, eventually it could be panic or shutdown or intermediary stages where essentially they stop learning. And I'd really like to share I'll stop sharing this, a quote from Stephen Porges, who you may be familiar with from his work on this notion of this polyvagal theory, which underpins that previous diagram, the notion that we have these different stress systems, one that gives us those kind of alarm and panic reactions, the fight, flight, sympathetic reactions, the other that gives us the cut off, shut down, dissociative type reactions, which is this kind of primitive parasympathetic part of our autonomic nervous system. Then we have the more recent and particularly kind of mammalian part of our autonomic nervous system, which is this social connection system, again run by aspects of the parasympathetic nervous system in particular, amongst other brain networks. So this quote by Stephen Porges, and he says, safe environments are important for everything we do, and especially for therapies. I started to think about mindfulness meditation, realized that even mindfulness meditation exercises need to be conducted in a safe environment. It becomes obvious when you ask questions about how breathing and attention are influenced by background sounds and how easily can become distracted and hypervigilant. I also realized that recruiting the defensive systems associated with sympathetic nervous system activation was incompatible with mindfulness. Perhaps a simple way of understanding this point is to realize that mindfulness requires a state that is non-judgmental. However, this would be incompatible with states of defense in which evaluation is critical for survival. I'd probably question that in the longer term, this sense of incompatibility of mindfulness with states of activation of our sympathetic or even parasympathetic nervous system. But I think there's something really important when we're learning mindfulness about that sense of how, if we want to learn effectively something new, it's really important that we're not in a situation where we feel unsafe. And if the focus for our attention is not a focus we feel safe with, then what might that do to our learning about mindfulness? So, and I think when he talks about the influence by background sounds, one of the ways into that is thinking about the startle reflex. If there's a sudden loud bang or a bright flash, or we get suddenly knocked or jostled, that we trigger the startle reflex, which is this complex set of survival mechanisms which cause our musculature to tense up, ready to fight or flight. It causes our breathing muscles to tense around the abdomen. So our abdominal muscles tense, and that means that we can't breathe abdominally. We have to breathe thoracically when that startle reflex goes, because by locking our abdominal muscles, the diaphragm doesn't have the give to move down. And that means the only muscles we can use are in the chest. What I'd like to do at this point is just have a moment just to see if there's any kind of reflections to come in around that. So I'm going to put the whiteboard up. Anything you wanted to come in with there, just around that whole notion of, I suppose, particularly that notion of staging mindfulness. Does that make some kind of sense, or any experiences around that, or you feel no, actually that isn't how it is, would be as interesting? There's a question there about what does this mean for prescripted? Yes. I think if you use guidance that is prescripted, that could also be whether you're part of a course that requires you to follow a particular curriculum, then I think one of the things you could think about there is chunking up whatever you're doing into smaller pieces. So most practice, and I'll touch on this in the next session around the body scan, but it's a really good example of where we can kind of make a smaller version of something that feels kind of quite huge. But around breathing, maybe think about if you have a kind of pre-scripted guidance around is going to be a breath practice here, maybe giving people choices about how they connect in with the breath. So you might do a lot of little short practices of different ways of noticing the breath to say, find out if there's one that's comfortable for that person. That's what I plan to be doing the second half of the session. If that kind of responds to that. Yeah, safe. That's interesting. So you're using secure. I'm liking steady at the moment. I think this is probably something I'll be kind of changing as things go on, but I'm enjoying kind of steadiness as a word instead of safety, because I agree with what you're saying here. I should read this out actually. What are your thoughts around the use of safe? As I've heard some teachers reference how this could also be a trigger. I've stopped using it and changed it to secure. Mainly a potential trigger for anyone who's experienced trauma and been in a safe place, either that, for example, their home. And yeah, I think it's quite a loaded word and it's a big word. And I quite like using language that's kind of low key, like rather than self-compassion, kindness, like can you be on your own side, have a sense of having your own back, or be a kind of a bit less hard on yourself even. Um, So someone here saying, it's good to hear about the stages. I just completed David Treleaven's trauma sensitive mindfulness training. Is unsure whether we immediately teach about window tolerance and introduce techniques, or whether we start with the basics of mindfulness. I think it's hard, isn't it? Again, from a person-centered point of view, I think I always think about what's going to be most empowering for the people I'm working with. And so sometimes it's information. So sometimes being able to place yourself on that kind of window of tolerance and say, oh, actually, I'm with someone, we're talking about something where for the first time I'm kind of understanding what's happening. And actually, I'm getting this message that I'm not broken. This is actually protective mechanism. They may not be ones I want, and they may not be helpful in my life, how they're happening, but I'm getting this sense of how this is all kind of my system doing its best to kind of get me through. And maybe this is about learning something, kind of different ways of going about that. Other times it may be the experiential side of coming into something that's concrete and sensory, might help someone come into a space where they could even hear about notions of a window of tolerance. So I think that sense of if we can get a sense of where people are, is quite helpful. Safe enough is interesting. Yeah, so comment here, safe enough seems helpful for some people living with trauma. And I think often if we have, particularly working one-to-one, we can ask people, how would you describe, a situation where things kind of feel as best as they could be, where you feel able to connect to people or animals, or a place you go where you feel a little bit less overwhelmed. What's that like, and how would you describe that? And maybe start with that person's language. It's interesting. So I find aspects of helpful for myself rather than an all-encompassing safe. I'm able to connect with aspects of safety in my experience which help me widen my window, yet I'm unable to access feeling fully safe. So it seems really important to kind of acknowledge that. And again, I'm really like the notion of graded exposure that comes out of CBT, but also links to educational theories for those of you into this stuff. Good old Lev Vygotsky and his zone of proximal development and the kind of learning zone model that came out of that. That's all about this sense of how can we take steps towards what feels at present too much, rather than jumping straight into what's kind of overwhelming. And we kind of do that in every place where we do learning. pretty much kind of do a marathon, start small, build. Education, learn these simple sums before difficult ones, learning to swim, shallow end before deep end. I think something peculiar happened in the context of kind of mindfulness practice where it's kind of okay for people to drop in the deep end somehow. And why that would be the case, I'm not quite sure. I think an incremental approach, which is very much the work of David Treleaven, Willoughby Britton, and others. I think it's kind of really helpful what is growing out this sense of let's take things slowly at people's pace, and that's kind of mindful, isn't it, and compassionate. So it feels odd to me that sometimes this seems a little radical to be suggesting that. What I think I'll do at this point is, shall we just have a 5-minute comfort break at this moment, just have a move around? So we're going for about 45 minutes. My proposal to come back is to start with another experiential exercise. This is just to share some of the ways I might introduce kind of working with breathing, and then again kind of unpack that a little bit, why I might approach things in that particular way.